for ABNY hosting this. This is great. I think it's terrific that people are getting one-on-ones. So Amanda asked me to talk about zoning and land use and kind of how the zoning code evolved and what it does, and then where I think it should head going into the future. So zoning's about 100 years old. It's celebrating its 100th birthday. Some think that it should rest in peace now that it's reached 100, but it should at least change. And it's interesting, zoning started just over here at 120 Broadway with the Equitable Building. It's gone through various incarnations, a couple of reforms. When the Equitable Building was built, it cast a 7-acre shadow in Lower Manhattan, and there was a huge outcry, and people basically said, we need to somehow regulate this. And in 1916, the nation's first zoning resolution was born here in New York City that called for a lot of setbacks, these famous Hugh Ferris drawings that would allow light and air to come to the street. And then in 1926, there was actually a Supreme Court case where it was argued as to whether or not zoning was a taking. It's interesting, the zoning code is actually enforced by the building department, and that's under sort of health and public welfare, which is different than police powers, but it is sort of established law of the land now. Most major cities have a zoning code. Our zoning code has not gone through too many major transformations. There was a pretty significant one in 1961, inspired by the Seagram Building in 1958 by Mies van der Rohe, that allowed for basically more of a tower in the park setting where you would get a bonus for building a plaza. I'm sure many of you have seen those bonus plazas. Many of them are atrocious, and a few of them are great. And then under Mayor Bloomberg, and under Chair Amanda Burden, I think we did 119 rezonings at city planning in the mayor's tenure. And so he introduced a number of new concepts, voluntary inclusionary zoning for affordable housing, the FRESH program to create fresh food in food deserts across the city, and really changed the landscape of the city. And much of what you see under construction today at Hudson Yards, around the High Line, all of that flowed out of the downtown Brooklyn, all of that flowed out of the rezonings that were done under the Bloomberg administration. And then, of course, Mayor de Blasio came in with a very aggressive plan for affordable housing, a lot of that also flowing through zoning, and recently passed what's called MIH, Mandatory Inclusionary Housing, which mandates the construction of affordable housing with certain types of new projects, as well as something called ZQA, which is an attempt to kind of loosen up the zoning code and allow for a little bit more design flexibility. So what is zoning? What are the basic principles? Zoning regulates three things: bulk, density, and land use. And people often confuse bulk and density. Those are different things, so let me explain what I mean. And there's a lot of things that flow from bulk and density and land use, a lot of complex concepts that are in the zoning resolution. A lot of those concepts are then interdependent, which is why the zoning resolution's like this thick. It's a very, very weighty document, but it still centers on those three fundamental concepts. So what is density? Density is really floor area ratio, FAR, which means how much can you build on a given site. That's not the same thing as height. So all three of these buildings are the same density. This is from the zoning manual. And it's just a question of how it stacks on the building and how much of the ground you cover, known as the ground coverage. And then bulk is different than that. Bulk is basically what regulates how you can build that density in terms of how high it can go, where it has to set back, and so forth. And then use, which I actually think is the most outmoded part of our zoning resolution, because use and use segregation is a fundamental part of what created zoning. The idea was that, you know, if you built a nice apartment building, you didn't want a glue factory coming up next to it. And so the notion that you'd separate uses this way, which is why actually the American property markets bought into the idea that there should be zoning, because it gave them predictability. So it was kind of this trade-off where you'd allowed to be regulated, but it also meant that you had some notion of what could happen around your site. And then there are a variety of bonuses, as I mentioned, the fresh bonus. There are a variety of affordable housing bonuses. Some of these allow this pour door situation, and different people have different points of view about the pour door. And then the public plaza bonus, which I mentioned before, and there was a kind of revamping of the design guidelines for public plazas. There's also this notion of transferring development rights, often from landmarks to nearby properties. There's also this thing called zoning lot mergers, which is what creates all the super talls that everyone's talking about these days, which is where you buy up all the air rights in a block and then you can pile them up into a big tall building, as we're seeing going up on 57th Street and some other places. So if you want to change zoning, there's really only one way to do it. It's this thing called ULURP, which always to me sounds like a big drink at 7-Eleven. But it's actually the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. And what ULURP basically does is you apply, or the city applies, to change the zoning resolution, and then it goes through a number of steps. The hard part is getting to the point where an application is certified, meaning that if you have a zoning application, getting everyone to agree that, okay, it's time for everyone to review this, it's a formal application. That's kind of the tough part. Once it enters that window, you're then in this period where for 60 days the community board reviews it, the 30 days borough president, and then after that city planning commission votes on it, and then after that it goes to city council. Some people feel like it's the land use equivalent of waterboarding, but at the same time, it has the value of being at some level predictable, I would argue. And it's interesting, once it enters this cycle, God herself cannot come in and intervene in terms of the schedule. The schedule is fixed. The other way you can get some things changed is through something called the Board of Standards of Appeals. This is a zoning variance, which is a different thing than a zoning amendment, which happens through ULURP. But basically where, I won't go into too much detail into this, but it's essentially if you have a hardship. So say your site can't meet zoning because you've got some groundwater condition or there's some other difficult part of your site, you can appeal to the BSA and say, I've got a hardship on my site. Let me bypass this part of the zoning resolution. And there's some things they can override and some things that they can't. Now, I wanted to kind of then talk about, well, what's wrong with our zoning code? I mean, all of that arcane detail aside, what is the real impact on our city and where is it kind of failing us? And I would argue where it's failing us is it's really built around this 20th century model of segregating everything, right? Which really kind of led to this. This is the basic consequence of a zoned society. If you look out on most of the American landscape, what you see sort of gated subdivisions, and that's all residential zoning. And then you have gated office parks, and that's a different form of zoning. And then you have like a gated academic campus, and that's yet a different form of zoning. And then they're all connected by roads. And this is a highly problematic way to organize our landscape, I would argue, especially when you look at what I will say are the three major things that are changing our landscape today. First and foremost, climate change, where we're seeing a geometric growth in the planet's temperature, and I think something that we should all be very cognizant of, and that argues for, as I'll explain, a sort of more compact way of living with less driving and more walking, more biking. Segregation in terms of race and class is also, I would argue, a consequence of zoning. Again, by segregating different types of housing and so forth, we've ended up with a lot of inequity, as the mayor and other people have pointed out. And I think our zoning code isn't fully culpable for this, but it's certainly aided and abetted the situation. And then the third most, I think, interesting challenge, which is technology. And technology is changing at this extraordinary rate when measured by processing power of chips. And we have 300,000 new technology jobs in this city over the last decade. That's an enormous number of jobs. That's the number of jobs that the city lost in the 1970s when the Bronx was burning and Son of Sam was running around. And so to have that kind of, those kinds of numbers in terms of technological job growth is huge. We did a study up at Columbia and found that 85% of those jobs have landed in pre-war buildings like this. My office is in a building like this. Most new companies are in buildings like this, and they're not gravitating towards those big glass skyscrapers. Some law firms, some other media firms and so forth. But I think technology is really saying the way in which we work is going to fundamentally change. And so when I think about these three things, climate change, inequity, and technology, I think the city is the landscape, kind of the platform in which, whether we do well or poorly at these things and handling these challenges, that the city is really the platform for how this plays out. So, in terms of climate change, it's clear that we need to live in a more compact way. We need to live in denser circumstances. Zoning, actually, it's interesting, if you look at the history of the country, over the 20th century, our cities became less dense. And that was largely because of zoning and restrictive zoning that didn't allow more density to be built in places. We need to build more densely, allow nature to be nature, stop zoning for subdivisions, and really live in a more rail-based way. And the other thing we need to really think about is that it's not just about a central business district anymore. My office is in the Flatiron. I walk to work. I watch people in places like the Flatiron, places like Dumbo, places like Domino, that I think really speak to the future, where it's not about everyone like Mad Men Manhattan coming in from Westchester into one place to work and then going back to their bedroom community, but something that's much more mixed and varied. And our zoning code has to not just discourage that, it has to actively encourage it. And what's interesting to me is that that means a different kind of city, what I call a networked city, right? In which people live and play and work across the territory of our city in these nodes. And that to me has dramatic consequences in terms of how we plan our transportation infrastructure, where affordability happens, because affordability isn't just about affordable housing, but I think it's also about how do you get your kid to school? How do you easily get to work? Where do you get groceries? All of those things that are a part of people's lives. And so, to me, we need to focus much more on what I like to call an infrastructure of opportunity, where you go beyond just traditional infrastructure, but think about affordable housing as a kind of infrastructure, culture as a kind of infrastructure, parks, medical care. And we need to look at that infrastructure and how it helps to build a certain kind of density that makes our economy grow. So one of the things that there's actually fairly good data on is that technological innovations in terms of patent creation and patent filings is happening at a significantly higher rate in places that are denser. Because there's this basic theory that's been around for a long time in city planning, which is when people live in denser circumstances, they interact more, they have serendipitous run-ins, they meet each other by chance somewhere, and they innovate. They say, hey, let's talk about this, and then the next thing you know, something is invented. And so, it's interesting, for 100 years now, we've been hearing about how technology was gonna undo the city. I remember reading an article in the 90s about how the fax machine was the end of the city. I mean, most of you probably don't know what a fax machine is. But this idea that we would telecommute and work from an office complex or work from a mountaintop someplace, if you think about most technological advances, they actually have been bringing us closer together. Try getting an Uber in a cornfield. Right, the density is actually a driving force behind technology. And so a lot of places, like in Barcelona is a very high-tech, very dense city. They're actually trying to get the number of people who walk to work to move from 30%, the current statistic, up to 50%. Because they believe that walking is good for people in terms of their health, but also because it creates a more contemplative city. They actually have policy that says, how do we get our people to innovate? Well, they should walk more. I mean, in Europe, you don't walk and use your cell phone. It's not a thing. It's a thing here, but it's not a thing there. And so I think this talks about a future city that is not just our central business districts, but kind of a network of villages across our cities. So if you think about a village as opposed to a suburb, in most villages, you can accommodate 80% of what you need, right, in walking distance from your home, where you work, where you go to church, et cetera, et cetera. And so clearly, we're moving from this model, that's this hub and spoke model, to something that now looks like this, and I think in the future will look like this. And so if you think about how you think about commutation patterns, how you think about where you put affordable housing, how you deal with climate change in terms of what areas flood and don't, they all have to really speak to that kind of an issue. And so we've seen this evolution of our city this way. When I worked for Mayor Bloomberg, we did the rezoning around the High Line, a huge group of people, which was really about transferring air rights away from the High Line and into new residential buildings, which obviously was enormously successful. My wife used to, whenever I'd work late at city planning, she'd say, what's there, a city planning emergency? Is something gonna happen in 40 years instead of 30 years? But this happened so quickly. And in a way, it happened so quickly that we lost sight of certain things, like in terms of the affordable housing plan that came with the High Line was based on rental housing, and most of these were condos. And so we didn't get a lot of affordable housing in the first phases of the High Line. And so, Amanda mentioned Essex Crossing and Domino, two projects that I worked on when I was a partner at SHOP. And these are both sites that have a tremendous amount of mixed use associated with them. So in addition to affordable housing, like Domino has about 600,000 square feet of new office space. The refinery is going to be in major office headquarters. That's an enormous rethinking of our city. And so this is the first building under construction, is a 70-30 affordable housing building. And I think quite a beautiful one. In the process of going through this rezoning, the community said, we understand big buildings are going to get built here. We actually want buildings that aren't all glass. This building is copper and zinc. And so the copper is meant to sort of patina on the site. And so the building doesn't look brand spanking new the day that it's built. And that's because Williamsburg has an industrial heritage. And then lastly, one of the things we're exploring at POW, at my new firm, is why do we even build buildings called housing and office buildings? Google's headquarters is in the old Port Authority building. It's an old warehouse building, right? Why do we think about these things in such a restricted way? So I'm going to fly through these, but basically we're looking at different forms of architecture that could accommodate a wide range of uses. So imagine that a jewelry maker could live next to a family of 4, next to an architecture studio, next to a technology company. And what's wrong with that? If you can actually protect all those people and make their livelihood sort of work in that way, it means that you'd have a much more sort of complex, rich kind of society as opposed to the kind of ways we live now. So I'm just going to close by saying I think the future of the city is something very different than the way we've traditionally thought about it, that it's not just about everyone coming to 1 or 2 downtowns, but really thinking about the city as this set of villages that really talks about the future. So thanks very much for listening. And